Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way. Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast. Today's episode is going to be about liberating yourself from judgment. As usual, nothing in this podcast is to be construed as medical advice. The intention of today's episode is to invite you to drop out of the judgment culture. I will be discussing why the culture of judgment causes so much pain, especially in medicine. Judgment causes physicians pain, patients pain, and contributes significantly to burnout and exhaustion. I hope that you will discover that once you see your judgment habit, you can regain power and control. The liberation is in the noticing. Only if you notice and see can you choose to make changes. Takeaways are that judgment is a habit worth giving up. Judgment is paralyzing. When you let go of judging yourself and others, it's like taking off ankle weights. And this podcast is a strong encouragement for you to notice where you judge yourself and where you judge others, and then to try to opt out. So this podcast was inspired by a few things recently. I did a retreat for a local medical system, and in our discussions and workshops at that retreat, this concept of judgment came up multiple times, and the idea of judging ourselves and judging others. And as many of you know, non-judgment is a key tenet of mindfulness and is also a key component of coaching. And so I wanted to begin with a word that I learned from one of my longtime clients. And the word is Maitri. Maitri means benevolent kindness. It means less judging, and it means unconditional friendliness. Friendliness to others and friendliness to yourself. And so one of my clients chose this word as her intention for all of 2023. And it strikes me as a beautiful intention and a way of moving through the world that would feel much better. And I think many of us believe that judging is the way forward. Judging ourselves and others is the way to better performance, more achievements, improved results. I would argue that benevolent kindness is the way forth, and that friendliness to others and self and/or unconditional friendliness is the path to the highest performance for all and a better world to live in. I think Maitri is also the invitation behind my favorite question, what would love do? Also, in having had this conversation at that retreat and then recently in my ongoing presence group, coaching for women physicians, it's clear that the medical culture teaches us not to practice Maitri. On the one hand, we're trained to do no harm. And on the other hand, we are taught simultaneously to be judgmental of ourselves, to push ourselves, judgmental of our patients, judgmental of students and learners, and pretty much judgmental all around. We are trained to think that this hypervigilance and judgment is, again, the path to achievement and good results. And yet, I'm not sure that that's the case. I would argue it's the exact opposite. So in medicine, we are trained, and many of you hear me talk about trained thoughts, to think that hard is better, more is better, and rest is judgmentally lazy and complacent. We are trained to think that constant hypervigilance and judging ourselves and others about our performance and their performance is what is necessary to make sure that we provide exceptional care, necessary to make sure they provide exceptional care. And yet, perhaps this hypervigilance and judgment is actually leading to less effective care, less sustainable care, and a less caring medical environment. My belief is that all physicians, every physician I have ever met, is hardworking. Every physician I've ever met is committed. Nobody who wasn't committed would go to medical school and work through the training that we all work through. Every physician I know also uses judgment of self and judgment of others to push themselves more. And in fact, this tradition of judging ourselves harshly against unreasonable expectations is rampant in medicine. And I believe it leads to shame, blame, and guilt. And so when we don't measure up, and perhaps we can't measure up to often these unreasonable expectations, the physiology of it is we feel shame, blame, and guilt that we didn't measure up and that we couldn't perhaps, because I, again, don't know a physician who purposefully tries to not do the best that they can. When we go into shame, blame, and guilt, we release cortisol and norepinephrine. We shut down our amygdala, and then we aren't solutions focused. We don't have this broad, wide view. We're not creative. We don't feel calm and grounded. And that is not the place from which to provide the best care. We're actually often in a place of imposter syndrome when we move through this judgment cycle. I would also argue that shame, blame, and guilt by releasing cortisol constantly leads to disease and less good health. It also leads to exhaustion. And in many physicians' cases, I think it leads to suicide. And so this was the inspiration for this podcast. And what I really wanted to focus on is how to move beyond judgment. And I think this moving beyond judgment is what we all really need. So the invitation in mindfulness is non-judgment, which is the opposite. I might offer that some people can't get to non-judgment right away, but could you get to neutral? Or could you opt out of judgment? I have found that this opting out notion is really, really helpful, or dropping out of the judgment culture that I mentioned at the beginning. We don't have to decide that we are going to be amazing at practicing non-judgment. But when the judgment comes habitually, we can opt out. We can remind ourselves that we are not going to be judging anymore, that this is an old habit and that perhaps it's not needed and perhaps it's not healthy. And so moving beyond judgment requires commitment, it requires courage, and it requires bravery. When we are moving beyond something that's a habit and something that we have relied on to help us get to where we are, and it's also a way that we really think about the world and organize the world, for many of us, it's very stressful. And so that is where the commitment, courage, and bravery comes. Moving beyond judgment requires many of the tenets of mindfulness I often refer to. So it requires practicing non-judgment, and or if you're moving stepwise, opting out of judgment, or even noticing judgment. Noticing where we judge is the first step. Awareness of how often you judge yourself, how often you judge others, and when we use judgmental words. Kindness is another main tenet of mindfulness that is the opposite of judgment. And so if we could practice kindness rather than judgment, or this concept of Maitri, would be really beautiful. Self-compassion and compassion for others and empathy are also the opposite of judgment. And so many of us are exceptionally empathetic as healers. We're certainly empathetic as mothers. And what we usually miss is the self-compassion. Many of us are exceptional at compassion for others, and the judgment of others is generally inadvertent. And we believe when we are practicing it that it's for the greater good or the higher good. And just noticing, coming back to the noticing and awareness and mindfulness, that it just might not be. Another tenet of mindfulness that can help you move beyond judgment is acceptance. Accepting you as you are, others as they are, acceptance of differences, acceptance of different ways of doing things, acceptance that there is rarely a right way and a wrong way. There are many ways to do things. Many of us who practice over-responsibility and toxic independence, we do so because we think there's a right way and a wrong way, and it's our job to make sure that these things happen. The other pattern that can help you step out of judgment is love. And as I mentioned earlier, what would love do? Love would not judge oneself or others. And I think that when we all want to move through the world as loving human beings. And so what would love do? It would not judge. Moving beyond judgment also requires a commitment to change. We need to see where we are judging and decide that this is not the way we want to move through life. We can, as I said, opt out of judging. We don't have to condone other people's behavior. We can accept, and we don't have to be resigned to their behavior. We don't have to give up on the idea of them changing, but we can change how we relate with them. And when we bring different energy to the situation, it's actually more likely to lead to change. Opting out of judgment or moving beyond judgment also requires commitment to better. It requires commitment to a different way of moving through the world. It requires that you choose to conserve your energy. Energy expenditure is a real issue, and there's going to be another podcast about energy conservation and the way that we manage our energy. It is one of the key things. We often talk about time management, but energy management is actually much more important. And opting out of judgment is a form of energy management, but it requires a commitment to attending to your energy, noticing how much energy you have, and deciding that you're going to conserve your energy for what matters most. And that is rarely judgment. Conserve your energy instead to care for yourself and others. Conserve your energy instead and expend it on kindness, expend it on compassion, expend it on curiosity. And that's actually one of the tenets of mindfulness I completely skipped over in terms of judgment. And to me, it is the absolute most important tool for getting out of non-judgment. If you just allow that you don't know, you can ask questions. What if it doesn't mean what I think it does? What if they are just as good? What if their idea works? What if this turns out better than I expect? It allows you to step out of judgment. You can ask, I wonder why. You can show up with how interesting, or you could say, I don't know why. All of these things are quick phrases that help you step out of judgment. So stepping out of judgment also requires trust. It requires trust in yourself. Many of us use judgment as a way to push ourselves. And yet we could trust that we are competent human beings, trust that we are the least lazy people on the planet, trust that things will work out. We don't have to police others. We don't have to judge others, and trust that kindness and love could be, if you want to show up curious, the path forward that leads to higher performance and more sustainability and better care. Moving beyond judgment also requires a willingness to value yourself. And so you have to trust that you are of value. You have to learn how to validate yourself internally. Many of us talk about, am I enough? And I would say thinking that you're enough is very hard. But what if you're doing the best you can? What if you are learning and growing? That is a very different way than to judge from the mistake standpoint. Many of us feel like if we stop judging, that we will be condoning or we will be allowing mistakes. And I would say you're not allowing or condoning. You are literally learning and growing. And judgment leads to failure, as opposed to this idea of learning and growing when there's a mistake. And so rather than judging mistakes, could you learn and grow from mistakes? That would be an easy route to move beyond judgment. So midway through the podcast today, I wanted to offer some reflection questions. And these reflection questions are designed to think about judgment in your own life, not necessarily in the practice of medicine, although I have referred to some of this in the context of that, but in the practice of your life, how you judge yourself and how you judge others, perhaps people that you love, perhaps the way that other people live. And so I wanted to offer these questions. How many times a day do you judge yourself? Do you tell yourself that this judgment is necessary and helpful? Do you think that you are a problem or to blame? How often do you think this? Do you think, perhaps hidden deep underneath, that you don't measure up? Do you use criticism and judgment to push yourself to do more? Are you hypervigilant about your performance, judging little ways all the time? Do you judge others? Do you judge your children? Do you judge your colleagues? Do you judge your patients? Do you judge leaders? What would your life be like if you chose to opt out of judgment or move beyond judgment? What would your life be like if you showed up with your hands wide open, curious, asking, I wonder why, how interesting, or saying to yourself simply, I don't know why? So I encourage you to actually pause here. You can rewind a little bit and listen to those questions again. Pausing when you have a pen and a paper, if you're listening in the car, re-listening at another time, and asking yourself those questions. What would life be like if you dropped out of the judgment culture, opted out of judgment, or moved beyond it? So, in the second part of the podcast, I wanted to talk about judgment in medicine specifically, because judgment in medicine is rampant. And as I started to think about this idea of judgment, one of the things that I think many of us don't like to admit to is that we are taught many, many, many judgmental words about patients in medicine. A few examples would be failure to progress, or failure to thrive, or an incompetent cervix. We sometimes refer to patients as non-compliant. We have them coming in complaining of things rather than having concerns or worries. We make a problem list, implying that they have a list of problems. And so thinking about different ways of presenting these diagnoses and the way that we discuss and talk about patients. We also judge different diseases. For instance, psychiatric diagnoses are definitely come with a little bit of judgment, where we often talk about how their complaints have a non-pathological cause, or that many specialties, chronic abdominal pain, migraines, chronic fatigue, there's a lot of judgment about certain diagnoses. We also have a lot of judgments about sleep and whether people sleep well, whether they need medicines to sleep. We judge their diseases, whether they're controlled or not controlled. We judge people for how quickly they get off pain meds and how much medicine, and whether their disease is managed or controlled with medicines or without. And we often talk about the patients that are recovering faster as better. They're rock star patients if they are perhaps walking post-op or off opioids sooner. We do a lot of judging about pain medicine and the usage. And while I fully understand that opioids are not a good habit and not good for you, except in sort of urgent acute settings, I think the thinking about how we judge patients and how they're responding to their disease and how they're doing, this judgment is under the surface. It's often unconscious, although, as I mentioned, these words, it's in the words. And I think it's really helpful to think about the words that we use and think about how much judgment is implied in the words and how the words make us feel. If someone told us these things, how would we feel? Many of us take care of that ourselves because we judge ourselves for these same things. As I mentioned in a previous podcast, I judged myself for how quickly I was recovering post-op. I judged myself for how much pain meds I needed or how far I could walk. And if you think about optimal healing and caring, that is definitely not part of it. And so that is an old habit. Thankfully, I saw it. And thankfully, I knew to practice hand to heart, to practice kindness, to practice Maitri. But many of us fall right into that. And if we are tired or not our best selves, sometimes we don't even notice. And if we've never stopped and paused to really think about the role that judgment plays in our life, then we move forward unintentionally, judging ourselves and judging others. And we tend to judge others because we judge ourselves so harshly. And so I wanted to also bring up the culture in medicine of judging ourselves and judging our colleagues. And so we are actually trained to judge ourselves. We are trained to notice how we don't measure up, how we don't fit in, and what we don't know. And if you think about sort of root causes of imposter syndrome, thinking back to rounds in our training, seeing how you don't measure up, seeing how you don't belong, seeing how you don't fit in, and being sure you figure out what you don't know so you can go home and learn it before anyone discovers that you don't know it, rather than an idea of sharing, learning, growing from each other, being collaborative as a team, everyone learning and growing. The culture of medicine is also quite hierarchical. And we have chiefs and chairs everywhere. We talk about years of service. We talk about, if you think about the training and the fellows and the residents and the med students and the sort of culture of scut work and the people below you and above you, and that the people above you, you're supposed to know more than you. And instead of, again, the sort of teamwork approach, one of the things I've discovered recently at several retreats, which is really powerful, is that people have imposter syndrome at the beginning of their career and at the end of their career, and probably in the middle too. But the people who are beginning think that they haven't ever learned it. The people at the end of their career think that the people at the beginning of their career know more because they're closer to their training. And then the people in the middle feel like they're distracted with life, and they don't have enough experience, and yet they're not new. And so someone will discover it's okay to not know things when you're new, but it's not okay to not know things in mid-career. And so my point is, we're all judging ourselves all the time. Everybody thinks they are an imposter. And so this kind of idea of the hierarchy in medicine is just a very, very strong culture. And to me, this hierarchy allows this undercurrent of judgment of those below you, and that we give feedback, but we're also judging, med students, residents, and all of these things. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. We judge people as problem residents, problem students, problem doctors in the department. And having been a chief of the department, that is sort of a culture that comes across, in training of leaders. It's, I think that nobody means badly by using those terms. And yet I think we just need to be thoughtful about maybe they're growing, maybe they're taking longer to develop. Funnily in PEDS, we also call it developmental delay. They're delayed in learning to walk. And so the delay has a little edge of judgment to it, rather than it's taking them longer to walk. I realize you have coding and other things, but it's just very interesting to think about the words that we use and whether they are caring words. Because to me, if we chose caring words and caring descriptors of things, it would change the way we all feel about our jobs. It would change the way we feel about patients, and it would change our willingness to treat ourselves in these ways as well. The other thoughts that I just wanted to share is, as chiefs, we are often trained to give feedback. We are trained to give constructive feedback. But when I was trained, we were also trained to tell people they had to have something to improve on. We had to answer, there's a whole box on what they needed to improve on. What is their, people now have tweaked it slightly to be their growth area. And I used to tell doctors that this was one of the boxes and we had to fill it in, because most of us judge ourselves so harshly if there's anything, because we are perfectionists and we are people pleasers. And so when someone tells us there's something to improve upon, even if they've just told us that 98% of what we're doing is great, we're doing, or we're performing at a super high level, maybe even beyond expectations, then they have to tell you something to work on, and it feels terrible. I was actually filling out a recommendation for someone last night, and there was the box. It was at least, what is this person's growth areas, or what are the things that they need to work on? And I think it's helpful to put it all in the context. And at least for that, it was like, what are their strengths? What do they need to work on? But again, I think when we get to the what do they need to work on, it's rarely in the sort of, this is how we're going to help them improve or become better at something. It's, what are their deficiencies? And so I try very hard to think about it as growth, development, professional development. I think, when I talk about coaching, in fact, coaching is not something just for people who have problems. It's a performance tool. It's about how to show up in ways that are more functional, more effective, waste less energy, provide better care. And so what if it was, what could this person do to provide even better care, for example? That's a little bit different question than what do they need to work on. So again, I think it always is so funny, always comes back to the words that we use. And what I have noticed is once I've started to think about this judgment and how it influences culture, we can create a much less judgmental culture by literally noticing carefully. The other things that are used for judgment and tools are, patient satisfaction scores, HEDIS scores, chart completion, peer review. Interestingly, these are all kind of meant to be ways to improve care. And yet, if you look at how the medical system uses them, they're generally used to judge us, rank order us. And again, it gets away from the original intent, which is improving care. And they are used for, bonuses and losing money. There are people whose, charts aren't completed in a certain way. They actually get fines or money taken out of their paycheck. And peer review, there's a lot more there. And so I just want you to think about how we use these things. And even if those tools were not intended to be about judgment, I don't know a doctor who takes patient satisfaction scores and doesn't judge themselves for the one that's not perfect or the 5 that aren't perfect or feel like they're being judged if they have dropped. And so from my perspective, generally, all of these tools, they're not really a reflection of how great a doctor you are. They may be a reflection of your communication, or they may be a reflection of the patient panel population that you have, or there may be a reflection that something's going on at home or you're not well. And what if we use these as opportunities for investing in our physicians, training them, teaching them, helping them grow, thinking of them not in a punitive way, but as growth and learning. And if we could look at them not as judgment and as a problem, but as a spot where we could invest in people. Thinking also another form of judgment that I really haven't thought about, and I apologize, the Blue Angels are flying overhead in San Francisco, so there's not much I can do about that. We call physicians who are struggling, we put them on performance improvement plans. And that is a pretty judgmental spot to be in. And I heard at a recent conference this idea of performance investment plans and investing in physicians. And if physicians are struggling in a certain area, could we invest in their performance? Could we invest in their ability to care? Could we invest in them as humans and in their careers? And how different would that feel? So the last thing that I really wanted to touch on today was this idea of feedback and judgment. And in my experience, this also came up in an ongoing presence session recently, the idea of we tend to judge residents, for example, and label them as problem residents, or we may not even label them, but we think about them as the ones who are challenged or struggling. And if we thought about it in a caring Maitri kind of way, we might choose different words and have different energy. But what comes out of it is the evals or the feedback sessions. And this is also a bit true of peer review or M&M. They're very focused on judgment and blame and what you haven't done right and why it's your fault. Peer review in particular, we give scores and we focus on finding blame with either the system or the individual. And I think that if we could stay out of blame, shame, and guilt and finding the blame, and instead focus on how is this an opportunity for learning, we would stay out of blame, shame, and guilt, and we would all learn much, much more. And so my thought about feedback with both attendings and trainees is that pretty much the way that we generally do feedback leads to shame, blame, and guilt. And as we talked about earlier, when you get to shame, blame, and guilt, you shut down your amygdala and you're not learning. And so I like to think of what are you hoping? How do you hope that your resident will feel at the end of the evaluation? How do you hope your colleague will feel at the end of the evaluation? My hope would be they would be inspired. They would have hope. They would be energized. And that always comes when someone says you're doing great. But if they have things to work on, how can you present those things as in a way that helps them to feel inspired? So if this person felt inspired afterwards, how would I explain what's going on with them. I would clearly not make them feel isolated, alone, or at fault. You would, if you think about like a 1-year-old who's learning to walk, we don't blame them or tell them they're not doing it right or they're taking too long. We believe they're going to do it. And so having someone come out of an evaluation believing in them is incredibly powerful, and letting them know that they are believed in. You can gift them. We've talked about gifting them your belief. In a podcast a few weeks ago, one of my clients talked about how she borrowed my belief to make the leap to do something that she really wanted to do. And so I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. And could we approach evaluations from strength-based evaluations? Really focusing on what people do well. And honestly, in medicine, we're very targeted and focused on what people do wrong. And we spend all of our time on that. And instead, could we learn from what someone does well? And in coaching, we often take what you're doing well and apply it to the areas that you're having trouble. It looks a little bit different, or the ways that you want to change. And when you learn what works for you naturally, innately, so again, strength-based, the solutions and the paths forward are so much easier. And so these are some thoughts that I just wanted to share. I think the last bit about peer review / feedback is setting an intention about the energy that you want to bring. And I think as a chief or a leader, or as a teacher or a continuity clinic preceptor, setting an intention for the energy you want to bring as you are working with those below you would dramatically change the culture of medicine, and making sure that judgment, inadvertent judgment, because I don't think anyone's coming into this wanting to judge, but making sure that that is not a part of the intention. What if your intention is caring for those you're teaching, caring for yourself, caring for the patients, caring for the culture of medicine, caring for the future of medicine? So those are my thoughts on judgment, a lot of them. And I will offer that judgment is a part of all of us, and it's not necessarily bad. But if we do a lot of judgment, it's probably not how we want to move through the world. And what we can control, as I always talk about, focus on what's in your control, is how much you judge yourself, how much you judge others, the language that you use, what you do, what you say, what you think and feel, and the energy with which you do it. So a few more reflection questions as I end the podcast, specifically about judgment in medicine. What would happen if we stopped judging our colleagues and med students and trainees, and instead partnered with them as teammates? What if the focus in medicine was on caring well for ourselves and for others? What if peer review were about learning, growing, evolving, and caring, rather than blaming, finding the systemic or human fault, and issuing scores? Are you willing to stop judging your colleagues and trainees? What would it be like to work in medicine if you opted out of this judgment of medicine? Opted out of judgment in medicine. What would it be like if you showed up at work and in teaching environments and in peer review and for your own feedback and or giving feedback, curious, with hands wide open, asking, I wonder why, how interesting, or I don't know, with your patients, with your colleagues, and with your students? So that is where I will end this podcast today. I am wishing all of you the opportunity to notice judgment in your life, hand to heart for where it came from and all the times you've practiced it, and to consider the opportunity to drop out. Consider the opportunity to move on and move beyond judgment. So I hope this is helpful and inspires you to think and move forward with more intentional words, more intentional actions, more intentional thoughts and feelings, and more intentional tone and energy. May you all be well. If you want to work on judgment in your own life or your practice or your clinic, please reach out to me. I work with individuals who are in medicine and some who are not in medicine. Many other fields also include a lot of judgment. Parenting includes a lot of judgment, and even our intimate relationships often include judgment. So if you'd like to work on opting out of judgment, reach out to me for individual coaching. If you would like to change the culture of judgment in perhaps your leaders or perhaps your own clinic, consider setting up either ongoing group coaching for your group as a team, or arranging with me to come and speak, and or arranging a group retreat with me. They're fabulous. And these conversations shift people's perspective and shift the way they move forward every single time. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, we would be greatly appreciative if you would leave us written reviews. They are the most helpful to us. And stars, they help other people find us. Thank you all for listening. Stay on after the singing bowl for our mindful moment, and we will see you all next week.
As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or uplevel your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely.
Welcome to today's mindful moment. Today's mindful moment is going to be a practice of Maitri and non-judgment and benevolent kindness, which will, of course, because I'm leading it, also include hand to heart and sending yourself kindness and love. And so I invite you, if it's safe to do so, sitting comfortably, finding your sit bones or your ischial spines, tilting your pelvic bowl forward and stacking your spine all the way up through the crown of your head. And coming to your breath with kindness, envisioning the inhale, sending benevolent kindness to every nook and cranny, and exhaling, letting it out. Once again, breathing in friendliness to yourself, and breathing out judgment. Breathing in friendliness and kindness to others. Breathing out once again, judgment. Breathing in benevolence, a belief that things are happening for the greater good and that you can contribute to it. And breathing out the tension and the tightness that's often associated with judgment. And pause for a moment here to notice how you feel already. Notice if your throat is tight, your chest is tight, you have an ache in your belly. You may have these things after listening to a discussion of judgment. You may have them as you even invite kindness. It may be unfamiliar. If it's comfortable for you, close your eyes and bring a hand to heart and another hand to top. Sending yourself benevolent kindness. Breathing in benevolent kindness. Breathing out judgment of self. Sending breath to bathe your heart, this organ of kindness and love. And exhaling the tightness and perhaps constriction or perhaps cement that you felt there. Letting it soften. Breathing in softness. Breathing out tightness. Breathing in filling, rejuvenating, restoring. Breathing out the depletion and the exhaustion. Pausing to notice how you feel. Pausing to consider the idea of unconditional friendliness. What would it look like to have unconditional friendliness and kindness towards yourself? What would it look like if you opted out of judgment of yourself? What are you afraid of if you did that? What if it turned out better than you expect? With this hand to heart, notice how you feel, pressing the heel of the hand into your heart space, releasing oxytocin, dopamine, feel-good hormones, inviting this friendliness to others and self to circulate around. Breathing in benevolent kindness to those around you, your family, your colleagues, your children. Breathing out our judgments of them. Breathing in acceptance, curiosity, hope. Breathing out resistance and judgment. Breathing in friendliness towards all the people in our world. Breathing out crankiness and judgment and frustration. Breathing in acceptance and curiosity about all of the other people in the world around us. Not condoning, not giving up, just accepting who they are in this moment with benevolent kindness. Breathing out, once again, anything that is not benevolent kindness, resistance to the way things are, the way others are. Bathing your heart and your body with oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, changing the neurochemical soup with benevolent kindness, unconditional friendliness, and Maitri. Enjoying this hand to heart, a practice of Maitri. Asking yourself, what would love do? What would love do next for you and for others today? What would benevolent kindness do for you and for others today? If you were practicing unconditional friendliness, what would that look like towards yourself and towards others? What would it look like if you brought it to your workplace? What would it look like if you brought benevolent kindness to your evaluations? What would it look like if you brought benevolent kindness to peer review or M&M? How much energy might you save? Taking a moment to enjoy this beautiful neurochemical soup circulating around, filled with love, filled with curiosity, filled with compassion and self-compassion, filled with kindness. When you're ready, you can lower your hands and open your eyes, taking in a big deep breath here once again. And exhale, letting things go and enjoying. Thank you all so much for practicing with me today. I will see you next week.